All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are All podcast. And Brian, I've been thinking, right? We're of course in very positive times in America right now. Of course, our standard of living, our just presence on the world stage couldn't be better than ever. And, we've been reviewing a couple albums recently that I would argue are, quite emotional, maybe even emotionally devastating. But you know what I thought, Brian? I think we can go back to having more positive lyrics in our albums. Did you agree with that, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's really reflected in the times. And I really, lately, personally, speaking for myself, I'm feeling very posy and I'm feeling very straight. Incredibly
Yes.
straight and incredibly posy.
And Brian, that's what both you and I have in common is that we're both very straight and very posy. I think we can both agree on that.
I am incredibly posed.
Exactly. So this week, Brian, you had the recommendation that we should review the album New Wave by 7 Seconds, a very
Excuse,
posy hardcore album.
excuse me, New Wind.
New Wind, yeah, sorry, New Wave. Not quite. You are correct. Although it did sound a little new wave, if you know what I mean.
It does. This is an interesting album for a pretty interesting band. Had you heard 7 Seconds at all before this, Taylor?
No, I had no idea. I think I heard the name, but I wasn't familiar with the band at all.
Yeah, I kind of was anticipating that. So you alluded to in the last few episodes, we've reviewed a lot of kind of darker post-hardcore, hardcore adjacent albums, and we're kind of chipping away at this whole idea of, what is post-hardcore, right? Like, or what does it mean to millennials, I guess. We're kind of looking at it from all these different angles, but this is one of the earliest albums that I think you would call unequivocally post-hardcore, and it's pretty different from most of the other albums, most of the later albums we've been discussing. 7 Seconds they're a very influential hardcore band. They don't have the name recognition of, say, the Dead Kennedys or Suicidal Tendencies or Black Flag, but they're like right underneath that. You might put them in league with like someone like previous podcast subject Poison Idea. And this album was incredibly divisive among the hardcore punk community when it came out.
Yes, and I'm very excited to get into that. So, this week we're going to be reviewing, once again, New Wind by 7 Seconds. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week!
Week!
Woo! Yeah! All right, and Brian, I've done the last two of them, so I am ready to hear your Cringe Generational Millennial segment.
So what I want to talk about is, I guess it's older news now. It goes back to the beginning of the month. Taylor, you and our listeners, I'm sure, will be familiar with the Blue Origin, blue-pilled, incredibly progressive and woke Jeff Bezos funded space mission, mission in quotes, that took place earlier this month, in which a bunch of very rich and progressive women got to fly sort of into space, and they're all astronauts now.
Yes, I am slightly familiar with it. Of course, I heard about it and I said, this seems like fluff. This seems stupid. I don't really want to pay attention to it. But at the same time,
you didn't think it was great?
No, I didn't think it was really cool. In fact, I kind of wish that, because Katy Perry was on it, I kind of wish the rocket had blown up like a firework.
Well, the funniest thing about that, so what I want to talk about today isn't specifically the space mission, which of course we all know. We all know Katy Perry. She sang Louis Armstrong in space, and she held up a flower, and she kissed the ground when she landed, seemed to like it, seemed to enjoy it. Even better than that. So, of course, the overwhelming response, I don't know if it's overwhelming, but a non-zero number of people responding to the Blue Origin missile said, similar to you, Taylor, this is kind of stupid. Maybe even worse than being kind of stupid. It's kind of weird in the present moment, right? It's a little weird with all of these things going on in the world, and in fact, specifically, all of these things going on happening to women in America, but all kinds of people, right? To have like Jeff Bezos, who also, stood behind Trump at his inauguration, for what it's worth, if that means anything to you, fly all these like famous chicks up into the air, sort of, for 10 minutes and bring them down, and I don't know, it's big push to have a kind of a unity driving moment. What's even funnier though is after people said that, Katy Perry immediately said, I regret making this public spectacle. She did a very Katy Perry thing, if you followed her at all for the last 10 years, where she apologized without really seeming to understand what she's apologizing for, and that was her whole deal. She doesn't apologize for the flight, she doesn't apologize for the waste of money, she apologizes for the spectacle. Now, I'm not really sure what that means. What it seems to mean is, I wish people hadn't gotten mad at me. I don't really care enough about the Blue Origin flight polite rather in itself to be like mad at Katy Perry. Like, what do I want from Katy Perry? Like, I don't expect her to do cool things or things that reflect my values. But what it got me thinking about is if Katy Perry, if any of these celebs, if any of us do anything, is it not for the spectacle? Why would she ever have done it if not for the spectacle? And I'm thinking about, like, what does that even mean in 2025? Like, in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, where everything is for spectacle. And that's even, like, us, everything, me and you and normal people. Like, what do? You know, we scream into kind of the void on social media. And I'm not saying that, like, oh, we live in a society, but it does seem to me very cringe elder millennial, which is just Katy Perry for what it's worth in general. But to say, boy, I wish I could just do something without making it all about myself, without posting it publicly. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, but what else are you going to do? That's all that you do. That's all any of us do. It's very funny to me, I guess, that it's funny to get too mad at the Blue Origin, like, launch, because, you know, and I think you probably kind of feel this way too, because you just said, you know, I don't really care about it. I'm not something I want to pay attention to, which I think is a healthy response. But even getting mad at it, it's like, what's the point? What is this? Because Jeff Bezos wanted to put his, like, wife or fiance or whatever into space, right?
Exactly, his big titty bimbo Latina wife GF fiance or whatever.
Yeah, and then he was like, oh, if I put 3 other. So to be fair, not all of the women on the flight were famous. I think there were a couple of legit astronauts on there whose names we don't hear, who are doing all of the work.
Yes, yeah, basically like the Sherpas of the,
exactly.
the flight.
No, exactly. And I mean, obviously it's Jeff Bezos and he's evil, and if you're working with him, you're working with him for evil, but, you know, everyone fucking uses Amazon. I'm not gonna, like, begrudge those women for this. They also probably got paid for it, which presumably Gayle King and Katy Perry didn't. I guess it's funny to me, the idea, first of all, of being mad at Blue Origin, but in a way, and I guess we're kind of doing it now, and since I'm talking about it, going like, oh, they made this big, you know, shallow social media debacle, this kind of play acting of liberal feminism in this really horrible time, kind of to make everyone feel like, oh, that's so nice. I guess Jeff Bezos is fucking Rosa Luxemburg now, you know?
Well, you know what, Brian? Just like Rosa Luxemburg, I hope he gets thrown into a fucking river. I'm just going to be honest with you.
Yeah, I hope that, like Rosa Luxemburg, that he gets turned into fascists by the DSA.
Well, you know, Brian, speaking of people who would totally be called fascists by the DSA, I think that leads perfectly into our review this week. Would you agree, Brian, of this band 7 Seconds and this album?
Any straight edge hardcore band. Any band really with any convictions might be called fascist by the DSA, but, you know, 7 Seconds politics are funny. I was friends with Kevin Seconds for many years on Facebook, and I sent him a couple emails. Kind of just seems like a base celeb.
I can see that just from the lyrics of this album, which we will certainly get into. But these are like endearingly earnest lyrics, and I love them.
Yeah.
I'm being honest.
Yeah.
I love the lyrics on this album.
No, I agree. No, there is a whole genre of hardcore that actually doesn't really start with 7 Seconds. It starts with bands that were influenced by them, like Youth of Today. But there is a literal subgenre that comes from the late 80s, early 90s called posi-core. And that's its whole deal. It's positive hardcore. And 7 Seconds are in a lot of ways like the archetype of that.
Yes, very much so. And before we get to the synopsis here, let's get into some details of the album. So, it came out in 1986. It was performed by the band 7 Seconds. I wasn't able to find a lineup for this album because, Brian, this did not have a Wikipedia article, so it was kind of hard to do a lot of research for this specific album. But the two main members of this band are Kevin Seconds and Steve Youth, who are brothers in real life.
If you would like, I didn't think about it till just now. We can come back to the lineup. I have this on vinyl. So we can come back to that later.
And this album was released on Positive Force/BYO Records, who I'm assuming that was like their personal record label or like maybe a friend's or something like that, because I couldn't find much info on that either.
Positive Force was Kevin Seconds' record label of 7 Seconds. BYO is the Better Youth organization out of, they're out of LA, I believe. Founded by Sean Stern of Youth Brigade. Better Youth organization initially did other things. They did charities, they organized shows and events and all kinds of things. Kind of the idea was organize the early hardcore punk scene in a non-nihilistic, productive way. They weren't straight edge, but it kind of shared some of the tenets with that. Sean Stern's whole thing was like, well, punks don't have to be aren't these chaotic, mindless, destructive kids, we're kids with something to say, kind of trying to actualize in America the Joe Strummer thing, the kind of positive, like righteous anger thing. By this point in the mid to late 80s, I would say BYO is probably mostly a record label, but they were kind of a movement initially.
I like the Better Youth Organization thing. I'm like, that's very earnest, especially for this era. Because when I think of hardcore in the mid 80s, I think of, I don't know if the most positive social scene, I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah. And that's 7 seconds are in direct response to that. Like, you can see a lot of like influence from Minor Threat in 7 seconds, but I would say like Minor Threat are still, even then, even though they're positive, they're a lot angrier, right? And 7 seconds kind of take the more positive elements of Minor Threat and they really ramp them up. What's interesting about this album in regards to that is earlier 7 seconds is like hardcore. It's aggressive, fast punk. It's a little more melodic than say your Minor Threats or your Black Flags, but it's hardcore. It's music by angry skinheads to slam dance together. This album maintains the positive lyrics, but it makes them a little more introspective. And I'd say the positivity is now reflected in the music, if that makes sense.
No, I think that very much makes sense. And like I said, once we get to the lyrics, we will definitely see that. And this album is about 30 minutes and 41 seconds long. And on Amazon, it has a 4.4 out of 5. And on Rate Your Music, it is a 2.99 out of 5, which is one of the lowest album ratings we've seen in a while on Rate Your Music. So I know you said this was a very controversial album when it came out. And I guess people still kind of feel that way.
Yeah, so 7 seconds are a beloved band in hardcore. Their albums, The Crew, Walk Together, Rock Together, they're considered like classics of hardcore. For people that are into that genre, that's like up there for a lot of people with like Damaged by Black Flag, with like the ROIR cassette by Bad Brains. 7 seconds are not as, they don't have the name recognition of those bands, but they're on that level, the people who are in the genre. This album comes out 86, 87. I think it's recorded in 86 and I think released in 87. So here we're at the midst of like hardcore starting to fracture. So you've got the early emo thing is still going on in DC. You've got bands like One Last Wish, who began as Rites of Spring, you've got Embrace, Gray Matter. So that's happening, right? A lot of your more nihilistic hardcore bands are they're either breaking up or dying, or they're becoming like crossover bands and becoming a little more cartoony. Well, one of the directions hardcore took was, have you heard the phrase college rock? You familiar with that?
Oh yeah, I've definitely heard that term.
REM and like the Replacements and shit. Well, college rock a lot of the time was an outgrowth of hardcore in the mid 80s. That is one evolution of hardcore. It's like hardcore bands becoming more melodic, more interested in instrumentation, becoming more introspective and kind of catchier and putting in these jangly, almost kind of 60s Beatlesy guitars, right? This album to me, more than anything else, is like 7 seconds responding to the emo thing in DC. They're from Reno, Nevada, and kind of falling in line with the college rock thing. Like, this is not all that different from what the Replacements or Husker Du, who are also bands in the hardcore scene that became more rock and roll oriented, were doing. Some people love this album. Very influential. A lot of 90s and 2000s emo bands and pop punk bands are very influenced by this. If you know the band Alkaline Trio, this album was a huge influence on them. There are people here who think of this as like the end of hardcore. They hate this album. They hate what it means for 7 seconds, and they consider it like the end of an era. And that is still a pretty, not the dominant opinion, but it's a significant number of people in the punk scene who do not like this album when you talk about it with them.
Interesting. Once we get to the lyrics, once again, I'm very interested in seeing why that is, although I obviously have a very strong recollection.
Yeah, I think you have a pretty good handle on it.
Yeah, exactly. But before we get into our track listing, Brian, I have 2 Amazon reviews. Now, just like with a lot of our albums recently, there's not a lot of reviews on Amazon, so this one was pretty quick, but I just have 2 to highlight here, and they're great Amazon reviews, very intelligent, very introspective as always. So, our first review from Darren Griffiths, who gives us 4 stars, and the head of the review says, great record. And the body of the review says, great record by a great band. Go buy this now. 10 more words required? Jesus, Amazon, a bit pushy, aren't we? And that's what Jeff Bezos' fiance said when he was like, hey, can you go on this flight real quick?
Yeah, can you take a bunch of selfies with Katy Perry and tell everyone I'm a feminist?
Exactly. But, speaking of people who are also feminists, Brian, that leads actually perfectly into our very last review from Ajax Braz, who gives us 1 star. And the head of the review says, New Wind Notes. And the body of the review says, this is a great album. It really does flow. I think you can tell the songs were written fast, like they discovered this new style and went with it. The last track seems out of place because it was never there. I bought the LP when it came out. They must have stuck it on a re-release. Also, the original cover was just a picture of Steve Youth's baby lying on a bed. 5 stars. Then why'd you give it 1 star? Ajax. 5 stars, 1 star.
I think he might be sort of incorrect about the original album cover. I think there were limited pressings with that album cover as like an in-joke for the youth family. But the more common cover, the blue backdrop with the kind of black illustration of a silhouette, as far as I know, that's always been the main album cover. This person, even though they seem very silly, does make a good observation. I do agree that it sounds like the songs were written very fast, kind of like Steve and Kevin, developed this new kind of sound. They were kind of getting maybe a little bored with hardcore, and it does kind of seem like they kind of, maybe they were paying attention again to the whole Revolution summer in DC and the college rock thing, and they got really excited and basically cranked out this 12 or 13 songs really fast, I think.
Yes, and even before we get into the track listing here, this album is very like thematically consistent. It's almost like a concept album about like wanting to be the positive change you see in your life and leaving like toxicity behind. It's kind of amazing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and the thing is that is a consistent theme throughout with 7 Seconds. One of their most iconic release is a hardcore album called Walk Together, Rock Together, which sounds like a very corny, silly title, but it's totally unironic. It is a song about, kind of opposing nihilism and, white supremacy and prejudice in the punk scene in favor of like populist, like unity. It also has a cover of 99 Red Balloons on it. Their first full-length album, the album before this one, is called The Crew, which is again a hardcore punk album, but features songs like Trust, which is literally just a love song. It is a hardcore punk love song about the importance of like mutual trust and respect in an intimate relationship. And there's a song in there called Not Just Boys Fun, which is specifically about like proto Riot Girl stuff, like women's place in the hardcore scene.
Interesting. They seem like a very progressive band in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is that Kevin Seconds, he doesn't have necessarily the leftist bona fides lyrically of someone like Dave Insurgent or like Jello Biafra, where it's like a lot of satire and analysis. He just seems like this like kind of a nice guy who heard punk rock and like felt really energized by it and very sincerely felt like this was like, oh, I want the world to be nicer. And even at his most aggressive, it seems like that's always, although like he got into fights and stuff in the early hardcore days, and he said that himself. It's not like he was like this sweet pacifist all the time. This album seems a lot like, to me, one of the things you hear about a lot with the DC emo bands is they were starting to get tired of all the fighting, all the violence, and getting kind of frustrated by the performative aggro masculinity. And that's kind of how emo developed with bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace, right? Is like a response to that. And I think that's probably what this is too, is like a conscious rejection of that like kind of skinhead, like crew core violence.
Yes, very much so. And I think that leads perfectly into the track listing here. So there's 13 tracks in this album. The first one is The Night Away. And, I think this is a great opening track. Once again, it showcases what most of this album is going to be. And even though I know obviously you chose this, Brian, because it is the precursor to a lot of the albums we've been reviewing recently, but I really was not expecting this album to sound like this. So it kind of threw me for a loop. And to be honest with you, and I know we'll certainly get into it later on, but this album sounds very Smiths and The Cure inspired to me, especially in the vocals. Like I hear Robert Smith a lot on this guy's vocals, or like the punk version of it. It's very interesting.
I'm glad you said that. I don't know about the Smiths. I know from just when I would see Kevin Seconds posts online and things, I know he was a Cure fan. And actually, a lot of people have pointed that out with his vocals. I don't know. I can't confirm or deny. I've never heard him say that was conscious. But I will say, you're not the first person to say on his vocals, oh, he sounds a lot like he's trying to sound like Robert Smith. I agree with that, especially when you look at early Cure stuff like Three Imaginary Boys. I would assume that Robert Smith was a big vocal influence. I also think just in general, I want to point out Kevin Seconds, for hardcore punk in the 80s, a terrific vocalist, extremely melodic, does a lot of harmonies, has pretty strong vocal range, and also has kind of a little bit more expressive of a vocal range than most hardcore singers. In terms of like the Smiths and Cure kind of college rock sound, in the liner notes to this album, 7 Seconds literally thank U2 for their influence on it.
Interesting. I mean, of course, they are a post-punk band, inarguably the most commercially successful post-punk band of all time. So that would make sense, because I hear a lot of post-punk on here, too.
Oh, for sure. Especially like in the bass lines, I think, like definitely. My guess with the U2 thing, obviously they were probably listening to those early U2 albums. They were probably listening to like War and Boy. I kind of wonder if maybe the U2 influence isn't so much musical as it is ideological. Because musically, this is definitely definitely more melodic than the earlier 7 Second stuff. It's not hardcore in the traditional sense. But I also kind of think that the music on this, it's almost like a throwback to an earlier sort of punk. It almost kind of sounds like The Clash or like the Buzzcocks or something, like a late 70s like British punk band.
Yes, very much so. And next track on here is New Wind, which actually I don't think sounds very much like British punk, but it sounds like skate punk. I hear a lot of skate punk on this track. And this one is, I would say, the first song in the album that's very much a statement of purpose track more than the last track, because The Night Away is kind of vague. Whereas this one, they're really trying to make a fucking statement. Like they're trying to say that we're the new wind, we're the new movement. Basically, listen to us. We're trying to be more positive. Talk about posse hardcore, obviously, right?
Well, the skate punk thing, that's a really good phrase. 7 Seconds are one of the most influential bands on what we would start calling skate punk. In like the early 90s, you get bands like Pennywise and shit like that. Obviously, all those bands are listening to 7 Seconds. New Wind is one of the tracks. I agree. It does not sound like British punk. This is actually pretty close to what early 7 Seconds sounds like. This is basically like a hardcore song, just a little bit more melodic. And of course, the lyrics are very different from most hardcore. But this is one of the more, like, to me, like hardcore, quote unquote, songs on the album.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, especially in the vocal style and the instrumentation. Like, talk about the very fast, like, instrumentation and the very, like, basically yelled vocals by
shouted
this
vocals.
album standards. Yeah, by this album standards, because there's not that much shouting on this album, but this one, pretty straightforward for this album, for sure, absolutely. And it makes sense that it's the title track. It's incorporating new ideas while at the same time still being truthful to their past as a hardcore band, for sure.
It's funny listening now that people in the hardcore scene, so many people hated this album and saw it as like this great departure. Because it seems like when you look at a hardcore album from like 1989 to 1991, by then the whole scene was, you're getting out artists like Integrity and Born Against and like Nation of Ulysses. And it seems like the scene had caught up to like the post-hardcore thing and the experimentalism to such a point that like by 91, this probably would have seemed like pretty traditional hardcore. But at the time, I guess people thought it was this crazy, like, pop music. It was then, like, I guess people in the punk scene thought they were trying to be U2 when they heard this song.
Well, you talked about how they obviously shouted out U2, so I guess that would kind of make sense that people thought that. But either way, I don't agree. I think this is definitely better than U2 in a lot of ways. I'm not a huge U2 fan. I've never been a U2 fan, to be very clear. Not saying that they haven't made good songs, but man, Bono's
it's hard to
energy.
like him.
Yeah. Bono's a very unlikable guy. Just, obviously, Brian talked about separating the art from the artist, but like that's pretty much impossible for a band like U2 because like the like noxious liberal fucking like lyrics and like symbolism is like you cannot separate it from the music. It's like impossible.
It's also that he's like inescapable as a personality. So U2, they have a couple albums I really love. I especially love the album War, but it's tough to love them as time goes on because they've done so many obnoxious things and not a lot of heinous things, although a few here and there, but just so much obnoxiousness. And it's so outweighs the length of time that they've sucked, so outweighs the time that they were good that it almost like in my brain, it's almost like it's like how with classic Morrissey and classic Smiths to like Morrissey later on, it's almost hard for me to reconcile that it's the same person,
No, absolutely. And speaking of people that make me want to scream, Brian, that leads perfectly into the next track here, which is Somebody Help Me Scream. And, this is a song obviously about, trying to find a connection and just trying to, like I said, just try to create a connection. Like that's clearly what I think these lyrics are about. Somebody help me scream, somebody there to drown the fire, but a passion bonds a solid link. And, like I said, the lyrics in this album, especially for this era of hardcore, are fantastic. These are some amazing lyrics.
Yeah, I think there might even be a more specific intent with this song that ties in with the themes that you were talking about, Taylor, about creating a new movement. Somebody Help Me Scream. I was thinking about this today. It almost sounds like something that a hardcore singer might say to the audience at a show. And it almost is like kind of maybe Kevin, as the singer of this band, reaching out to his audience who are maybe in this really nihilistic, aggressive, like, hardcore punk mindset and saying like, oh, like I'm trying to like connect on some other level now. I'm kind of done with that like slam dance thing. Like, are you into this kind of bigger thing that I'm saying now? I was wondering about that today. I'm not sure if that's his intent, but it would make sense to me.
Yes, exactly. And the next song on here, Tied Up in the Rhythm, is another great example of, like I said, the very solid lyrics here. And like, was he like an English major or something? Or like, especially for this era of punk, like these are so good. Like, what was his background, Kevin Seconds? Or was he the primary lyricist, I should even ask?
Kevin was the primary lyricist. I know he used to write poetry. He used to write poetry books. I don't know if he like has any writing background. What I remember when he would talk about growing up in the cinemas, when he would talk about lyrical influences, he would talk about being very inspired by Joe Strummer of The Clash, and then of course like Minor Threat and Bad Brains. And he would talk about wanting to take kind of like the earnestness and the kind of social justice stuff of like Joe Strummer with like the directness of Ian MacKaye from Minor Threat and really distill that and like talk about what he wanted to talk about through that. But I've never really heard him or read anything by him that would explain why his lyrical style was so different from his peers, because it really is in his word choice. I also think there's like, even just in the way he uses syllables, I think he is a lot more conscious of that than a lot of hardcore vocalists. And I also think it might just be that he did want to say something that was a little different, so maybe he sat and thought about it. You know, it's easy, I guess, if you're a pissed off hardcore band to write like an I hate you, you hate me song, which is the classic G.G. Allen lyric. If you're writing something that's positive, it might actually be a little more difficult, and it might just take a little more thought. So maybe he just had to sit with it a little more, you know, because he didn't want to write be nice to each other and share your emotions.
Yeah, it's like a hardcore guy shirtless, like bald head, just screaming that at the audience. That's so fun.
I'm sure there were bands that were influenced by 7 Seconds that weren't as good at writing that had lyrics like that.
No, absolutely. And then the next track on here is Grown Apart. Now, this one's another one, talk about the connection. This one seems to be about, obviously, a connection that has grown apart. You know, there's not that strong bond anymore. And, you know, another thing about all these songs is that they're all very short. I think there's only one song that's over 3 minutes long. Like classic hardcore, obviously, very short, sort of emotional tracks. And in fact, most of the lyrics are easy, even though they're really good, they're easy to parse because they're only like 2 or 3 paragraphs long per song.
They're easy to parse because, yeah, they're not overly verbose, and also because unlike a lot of hardcore vocalists, Kevin Seconds is very clear.
Yes, very clear, very emphatic, and obviously, yeah, he's just a very good, clean vocalist. And you talked about the harmonies, like, yeah, he's like an incredible vocalist by this era of like hardcore, for sure. Like, you know, even though I'm not like the biggest hardcore like fan, like you are, obviously, but like, were there? I can't think of a lot of other vocalists who were this solid in this era of hardcore. Can you?
Not in this time, not in this era. I would say there were a lot going into the 90s who were more like this. Greg Graffin, another extremely melodic vocalist. But every time I listen to 7 Seconds, I think about that. I think like, oh no, he had an extremely melodic voice for a hardcore singer. And also like young. I think when this album came out, he was like something like 24.
I mean, Brian, that's retirement age for a hardcore guy. Let's be very clear.
Well,
all hardcore guys
true.
are like 19.
Yeah, he should have been dead by now. So one observation about Grown Apart, I wondered if you had any thoughts on it. I feel like there's a little bit of like an island influence. Like, you know, I've mentioned before, I think there's some influence from like British post-punk here. Does this song have a little bit of a reggae ska thing going on, even though it's kind of a fast song?
Yes, I do hear that. Obviously not like 90s ska revival, but definitely early ska. I can hear that, like the early 80s style. I could definitely see that.
Yeah, a little bit of like the Specials or something.
Yes, exactly. I'm not thinking about like fucking Real Big Fish or Cherry Poppin' Daddies or whatever.
Yeah, Cherry Poppin' Daddies. God, imagine calling your band that now. Yeah. That's so gross. Not like trying to be like a woke guy, but it's just like, hey, I'm a Cherry Poppin' Daddy. Like, ugh.
Well, you know what, Brian, speaking of unproblematic song titles, Brian, I think it leads perfectly into the next track, which is Man Enough to Care. Now, this was the only song in the whole album that did not have any lyrics I could find. I mean, I could probably re-listen enough and like figure out what's going on, but like just the title alone, talk about posi, right? Like this is early positive masculinity.
It literally is, actually. This is an extremely important song in the development of hardcore, I think both lyrically and musically. So musically, it's of a piece with kind of the rest of the album. It's, you know, I hate using the words falling under the phrases college rock or post-hardcore, because while they are accurate, it's kind of a thing where like, if you aren't in the loop, they're kind of meaningless. But this is, like most of the album, it's still punk rock. It's not really hardcore. It's kind of taking the ethos and the energy of hardcore, but doing something more melodic with it and catchier. I don't really like the phrase poppy, but yeah, a little bit poppier. But no, lyrically, this song is explicitly about how, you know, when you're a kid, you're told to be a man and to fight quiet and to not talk about things. And that's how you prove your like manliness and you express your manliness is by not caring about things and not caring about people and how, and it sounds trite now, but you got to think about what the hardcore punk scene was like in 1986 to say like, well, actually, like it's actually a much greater show of strength to be open and to be vulnerable and to reach out to each other and to like try to understand each other. There's a part of me that feels cringe saying that because it is goofy to say the words, but like I think I still like interact on a daily basis, I'd say, with like young men at my job who have a hard time grappling with those things and who seem like they'd be a lot better off if they, would kind of reconcile some of it. This is also one of my favorite songs on the album. I don't know if I have a favorite track musically on this album because it's all really good and it's all right up my alley and it all kind of sounds similar, so I just kind of like it all. But lyrically, this was a very important song for me because I loved hardcore in high school. That was like my whole world. And I also was not like a tough guy. I'm like this nerdy kid. I'm kind of effeminate. Like I'm not like, that's how I perceive myself. I don't know if everyone does. So like I felt this connection with hardcore. I loved the Germs. I wanted to be Darby Crush so bad. And that affected me in some bad ways as a kid. But I also like I knew I could never be like the guy at a Cro-Mag show, like busting heads, right? And I think a song like this felt, I don't know, I guess very validating to me. And it also helped me feel like better about like, it's still a thing I think about. And I think we've talked about it on the show. There should be outlets for young men to express masculinity that are positive because the response to a lot of the gender discourse has been kind of an overcorrection into going, well, actually masculinity is bad. And like, I don't really think that's fair because that's what a lot of people just are, that's how they identify. They can't necessarily help that, but there should be different ways to be that, different ways to express that at their disposal. So I think to do a song like this in a scene like the hardcore scene in the 1980s, kind of incredible.
No, I totally agree. In fact, in general, Brian, I think a big component of this show, a big motif of this show, if you will, a trope even, is that we really appreciate positive portrayals of masculinity. I mean, outside of like Ted Lasso, I appreciate basically every like conveyance of positive masculinity. And I think, speaking of Brian, another song that portrays that is Opinion of Feelings, the next track on here. And, of course, a lot of the songs this album, like I said, sound like Robert Smith and The Cure. And these next like 2 or 3 tracks are so Cure-like. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, The Cure were probably, I don't know specifically which hardcore bands that were into emo were influenced by them early on, but I can guarantee that when bands like Moss Icon and Rites of Spring and Embrace are bubbling up, I don't think it was exclusively The Cure. I think it was also bands like weirder bands like Gang of Four, but I definitely think, especially when you look at that first Cure album, their album Three Imaginary Boys, and then you look at the 80s kind of DC emo scene, the college rock scene, you see the fingerprints of Three Imaginary Boys all over it. This track in particular, Opinion of Feeling, to me this sounds like an early emo song. Like, I mean, there's shared elements of the music at New Wind with the original, the 1985 Revolution Summer thing, but this song just straight up sounds like something by like an early song, like a song by Rites of Spring or something to me. Lyrically, of course, it's a similar thing where it's about a lot of the emo thing lyrically was about sincerity. It was about embracing more varied expressions of emotion than anger and hostility, and that like you could do hardcore and have a hardcore ethos and a hardcore mentality and be uncompromising and sing about happiness or sadness or love or, kind of more nuanced emotions than just being pissed off. And I think that's pretty clearly what this song is about too.
Yes, absolutely. And then the next track on here, The Inside, like I said, is very, very Cure inspired. Would you agree with that too, Brian?
Yeah, actually listening to this, and like I said, I've heard a lot of people say that they hear a lot of Robert Smith influence in 7 Seconds. Typically, I don't myself hear it as much as other people do, although I know what they mean. This particular song, though, I really do. Particularly, Calendar has a very intricate bass line. This is a very post-punky, melodic, kind of technical and propulsive rhythm section. Yeah, very reminiscent of The Cure, or like something like Joy Division even. And again, just like very emotive lyrics. The lyrics on this album are great, but they do like repeat themes and they kind of refine themes, which this track does. I'd say this is, if you want to get into specifics, it's of course about the passage of time, which, there's actually a few more songs about that coming up. But yeah, a lot of 80s post-punk stuff going on this song. The next track, Expect to Change, I had an interesting thought on. I'm curious what you think.
So the only note that I had for this song is, even though I think that the singing on here is pretty consistent throughout, I would say this is probably my least favorite track when it comes to the singing, I'm going to be honest with you. It grates on me more than any other song for some reason, and I'm not really sure why.
It's also maybe it's just like, we've said before, this is an album with a very unified style. And maybe it's just like you were 10 tracks deep and the song wasn't hitting as hard. So you were kind of like restless because, to you, it sounded like the other tracks, but not as good. That would be my guess. But thinking about Expect to Change, I wanted to ask you, does this sound at all like Green Day to you, maybe?
Yeah, I can kind of see that. I'm not.
And the vocals specifically. The vocals here kind of remind me a little bit of Billy Joe Armstrong. And of course, this band predates Green Day.
Oh, yes, by quite a bit. Because didn't Green Day form in like 87, 88, maybe?
87. Yeah, they formed in 87. Yeah.
Billy Joe Armstrong was a glint in his dad's ball sack by the. No, I'm just kidding. He's not. They
Well,
formed. They were 6 months old.
listening to Expect to Change, the big thing that hit me was it sounds pretty influenced by the Buzzcocks, who are actually a band that influenced The Cure, early kind of power pop, what we might call pop punk to some extent, British band. But the lyrics, they're about this thing about how, we all grow old and we all think that we are who we are and we have this sense of identity that we create for ourselves. And we think like, oh, this is so true. This is so genuine to who I am. But like, we're all going to change in some way or another. And maybe those changes will be healthier if we anticipate them. I've never heard anyone from Green Day specifically mention 7 Seconds. I know I've heard Billy Joel mention dozens of other bands from this era. I've never, that I recall, heard him mention 7 Seconds, but this song to me reminds me very much of something off like the first Green Day album, the 39 Smooth album.
Interesting. I'll have to look into that because, Brian, I have never been a fan of Green Day. Very famously, I'm not a Green Day fan. I've heard
So
like their singles and basically that's it. And the singles kind of by force, I'm going to be
So,
honest.
since this is an old millennial show, and we probably need to talk about it at some point, I liked Green Day in like middle school and high school. And as I got more into like, even when I was like in high school and I was really into hardcore and like kind of old school punk, I still liked Green Day significantly more than other pop punk bands because I feel like you could directly hear what they were taking from those bands. But by like my 20s, I was kind of like, all right, I'm done with this. I don't really need this. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was cleaning my apartment and I was like, you know what? I'm going to listen to like Green Day's whole discography, just like as a project. And I listened to it all. And I kind of enough time had passed where I said, like, you know what? I don't like this as a punk band. It doesn't really activate the same feelings in me. I don't think it scratches that same itch. But as like kind of a Gen Xy, like classic rock band, or just a tight rock band that write good songs, pretty solid. So I've kind of come full circle where like I've liked Green Day and then outgrown them and now kind of figured out what my feelings are about them, I think.
Interesting. You have maybe reconciled your feelings on
Well,
Green
I've
Day, Brian.
I would even say that I have come around on a Green Day.
Listening to Green Day, did it make you feel like an American idiot, Brian?
Well, I feel like I was at a fork in the road. I had no belief. I can't remember the words to the song. It's a Green Day song, guys.
Honestly, Brian, this rant is making me become a basket case. Okay, I'm done now too. But speaking of Brian, things that make me go crazy, this next song, Still Believe. Now, this is the one that is musically the most unique because it starts off slow and plodding, and then it becomes a hardcore song.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting because this is a very self-aware song. This is a commentary song to a certain extent because it's basically about how other people are like selling out and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And I think this might be a self-aware thing because they're like, you know what? We're not selling out. We're just making the kind of music we want to make. Maybe?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the things with 7 Seconds and with a few other hardcore bands is there are bands that some people accused of selling out, like Huskadoo. Now, I don't really like the idea of selling out. To me, it's only selling out if you specifically make music that you aren't interested in making for the broadest possible appeal. It isn't necessarily selling out if you start in the underground and you become really successful with just making the music and developing the way you want to. But I think part of the thing is that already before this album, 7 Seconds were being accused by some hardcore punks of selling out. Their earlier stuff is hardcore, but they'd done some more melodic things. They also got criticized for some of their feminist lyrics, believe it or not. And I think this is Kevin Sagan's very self-consciously going, well, we're not. We're still like underground. We're still DIY. We're still touring in a bus. We're still outside of the major corporate system. Like, we're not selling out. This is like what we believe it is. I keep using the word ethos because that's like the best way I can put it because it's not hardcore music, right? But it's still, I think that's him saying like ethically, that's still what this is. And you would see that with some of the most like notable post-hardcore bands into the 80s and 90s. You get a band like Fugazi, whose whole deal, right, is that they do not sound like hardcore punk. They don't want to sound like hardcore punk, but that ethos is so important to them that they like live and die by it.
Well, Brian, talk about the selling out thing, which has, of course, been a motif, like you said, in punk and metal forever. But my favorite theory, or I should say accusation of selling out by a band, or towards a band, I should say, was when people said Black Flag were selling out during like My War. And it's like, yeah, you guys are really selling out living in a van where the lead singer has to wear one pair of shorts and he's eating dog food.
It's insane that people said Black Flag were. If you wanted to say that Cregan's selling out now, I wouldn't really. Again, I don't really use that term very often, but like I'd have a hard time arguing it. But the idea that My War is a sellout is so funny because if anything, the music that they started developing after Damaged, when they moved farther away from traditional hardcore, is so much less, even less commercial than hardcore punk. It's so much weirder. It's so atonal. It's so unpleasant for like normies to listen to. It's so funny to listen to side B of My War with like Scream and Three Nights on it and go like, oh yeah, they made this for the radio. They made this to get famous.
Yeah, well, fucking exactly. Henry Rollins eating dog food stuffed in a burrito and eating like free tortilla chips that he stole from restaurants for sustenance.
Yeah, what is he talks about? They used to stop at gas stations and read compare the nutrition like charts on the back of candy bars for what had the most protein in it.
That's the thing, Brian. That is the same level as Load and Reload for sure.
Okay, hot take. There's some tracks on Load.
No, honestly, I like Load and Reload. I mean, I don't love them. They're not like my favorite albums, but there's some good tracks on there.
But they did make them. I do believe they made them because like they were aware it was going to be more accessible than their previous albums to like a modern rock audience. A funny case about like the selling out accusations, and it's the last time we'll talk about them for 100 episodes, actually is when you think about Green Day, sometimes people like to say Green Day sold out, and like they may have sold out on the corporate level. I actually kind of think they've done some pretty lame stuff, of course, but I don't know if they ever changed. I think they're just kind of corny libs, and they always have been. They're like corny libs who love like 70s and 80s punk and classic rock, and they love The Who, and I think that's who they've always been. The interesting thing is, even back in the day, like when you and I were little toddlers, right? When Dookie comes out on a major label and becomes a hit, people in the punk scene were saying Green Day sold out. What's interesting about that is like musically, they kind of did the opposite, where their first two albums are like actually their first album, 39 Smooth, is very like college rocky. It's actually pretty similar in some moments to like New Wind or to like a band like the Gym Blossoms or something. And that's when they were underground. Dookie comes out and suddenly their sound is actually a lot rougher. That's the album with like Burnout and Basket Case and shit. And that album sounds a lot more obviously influenced by like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones and like traditional punk than their quote unquote underground stuff. So it's funny how different people define selling out in different ways. But I think I do agree that this specific song it maybe isn't even Kevin Seconds aggressively saying he's not selling out, but him making clear that like he still believes in all the things he believed when he was making hardcore. He believes in kind of the scene that he built, and that's still who he is, and kind of pushing back on any claims that he's like abandoning the underground or something. It's hard for us, for millennials and zoomers, I think, to realize how important the underground was as a concept. Like we grew up pretty much online with all, underground artists are online. You can find them all the time, right? And maybe you have to do a little more work, but it's not the same. But like being underground, being independent was like extremely important up until like the internet, and it took a lot of fucking work.
No, absolutely. Well, speaking of putting in a lot of work, Brian, we're on the last two tracks here. So the penultimate track here is Put These Words to Music. And this is, once again, another sweet song with sweet lyrics. It's one of those things I keep saying these, but like these lyrics are like, they're so adorable in a lot of ways. They're basically like, yeah, I want to love everybody and we should all love each other. And like, I'm just looking for a connection and I want you to be part of that. It's like, it's really beautiful.
So I've talked before about the band One Life Crew, right-wing hardcore band from Cleveland in the 90s who were actually very influential and were on Victory Records. But they have a song that's actually pretty funny where they're like, this is the 90s, man. Hardcore is supposed to be about unity. Wearing backpacks, packing sandwiches, holding hands. And like, obviously I hate One Life Crew. I think they're pieces of shit, but it is pretty funny.
I think the ultimate culmination of posse hardcore is that Anal Cunt album that was all love songs.
Yeah, what the fuck?
Picnic of Love. Yeah, Picnic of Love.
Yeah, my notes for Put These Words to Music, which again, great track. I don't think I have a favorite track on this album because I love this style of music. I love bands like The Replacements. I love hardcore. I love Rites of Spring. So, I'm inclined to love this album just kind of through and through. My notes for this just say big, celebratory, joyous, confessional, defiant. It's very 7 seconds. I also make a note of the bass on Put These Words to Music. Very catchy, very post-punky bass.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of the culmination of his whole album, Brian, is Just One Day, the longest song in the album. I believe, once again, this is the only one that's over 3 minutes long. It's a good final track. And like I said, it just seems like a culmination of basically most of the album lyrically and thematically. And I like listening to this one. I like listening to this one probably the most on my re-listen because, once again, even though I do like pretty much all the songs of this album pretty much equally, I want to hear more of it. And the fact is the longest, I'm like, I get more of it.
Yeah, I think this is a strong contender for best song on the album, in part because it is a little bit longer, so they get to play with a little bit more, not too long. But yeah, the key lyric to this song, Just One Day, is I'm not sorry because I started growing. When you look at this whole album in context, what they were doing musically, what they're doing lyrically, and kind of what they were developing out from, I think that's, like you said, it's a culmination of a lot. I'm not who I was a few years ago. I'm maturing, I'm changing, I'm doing something else now. I still have like the same heart I had, but I'm growing. I'm not stuck in this place I was at. I'm moving forward to something more positive, into something kind of, I don't know, wiser or whatever. And I think this song is very specifically about that. But the whole album leads up to that, right? Like he clearly, like both musically and lyrically, this was something that they really had to get off their chest. I mentioned I have this on vinyl. I could not find a lyric sheet with my record, so I don't have one. But earlier I corrected one of our Amazon reviews and I said that the guy was wrong about the album cover having Steve Youth's baby on the cover. And I said it's always been this blue silhouette that's on the CD version. I'm experiencing a Mandela effect because the vinyl record I have actually has Steve Youth's baby with a bunch of 7 Seconds merch around him on it. It does not have the blue silhouette.
God damn it, Brian, your memory betrays you. Do you need to be on a memory unit, Brian? Do you need to take a mocha test?
Man, I am genuinely embarrassed. I'm like, not only that, but I told the guy, I was like, actually, that's never been the cover.
But yes, so that is our album. Now, you said you have a bit of a discussion on the bonus track. Now, I did not listen to the bonus track, to be very
Good. The bonus track was released when this was put on CD. It's an outtake from the sessions. It is a nearly 8-minute track called Colorblind Jam. So it's pretty clearly it was not a serious contender for the album. It seems to be them experimenting and playing in the studio. Colorblind Jam, it is like an anti-racist song about unity. Of course, the use of the phrase colorblind is pretty cringy, but it's 1986 or whatever. But musically, here's the deal. It's them playing around with synthesizers and turntables and kind of trying to do like a dub ska thing. It kind of seems like they had heard Time Zone and they had heard what the Clash were doing, incorporating hip-hop elements, but it seems like they hadn't really listened to any actual rap music yet. And they were like, we're going to try doing that. Something kind of like Magnificent Seven by the Clash, or again, like World Destruction by Time Zone. And in fact, about 6 minutes in, it just turns into a cover of Destruction Time by Time Zone. Are you familiar with that song?
No, not at all.
Okay, are you familiar with the podcast Blowback?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
The opening track from Blowback, right?
Yeah, that is the band Time Zone. Time Zone were a project featuring John Lydon of the Sex Pistols and Public Image Limited and Africa Bambaataa.
Yes, I am familiar with this.
Colorblind Jam is like 7 seconds playing with synthesizers, drum machines, and turntables, doing a little bit of a rap, dub, reggae thing. Kind of just an aimless, like you can tell they're playing around. And then towards the end, it just turns into an off-the-cuff cover of World Destruction by Time Zone. It's fun, it's cute. Like I said, it seems pretty clear to me that it was not intended to be on this album, and it sounds like they were playing in the studio, It does kind of, to me, like I like when bands experiment. I like seeing these fun sides of bands. I don't hate that it's on the album. It's on the CD version I have. It's not on the vinyl version I have. Of course, it's on all streaming versions. It's fun, but it kind of does take away a little bit of the power of the narrative of the album, right?
No, I totally agree with that. And that's why I'm glad that it's not on the album. Because as we talked about, obviously, like thematically, lyrically, instrumentally, it's a pretty cohesive album. And to have that on what would be, or what could have been on an official release, I just don't think really works, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, for people that feel that way, it is on all official releases now, and it probably will be forever. On the earliest vinyl release, which it's not on, and maybe it still isn't on vinyl editions, but on every CD edition you find, it'll be on there. And it's on all the streaming editions. It will probably be on vinyl reissues, I would assume, but I'd have to check on that. It's fun hearing, but I don't really think the album as a cohesive piece, and again, it's very cohesive, it's very consistent and very thorough. It doesn't gain anything having it on it, and in fact, it kind of weighs it down, because it's like this fun novelty track. It's kind of like getting to see this band play around, and have fun with technology they don't normally use, but it's like, that's great, but that doesn't really entirely add to this album.
Interesting. Okay. Well, you know what? Speaking of Brian, there's no more bonus tracks, correct? That's the only one?
That's the only one.
All right. So that is our album review. Do we have any final thoughts before we get to our pluggables, Brian?
I've loved this album for a long time. I love 7 Seconds. I love really the punk, the hardcore scene from this era. You go from like 75, let's say, to like 86, 87 of punk rock. There's this whole world of bands there that just like for 10, 15 years of my life, that was my whole world. This was pretty important I was really into hardcore, helping me kind of pivot from hardcore into sort of more nuanced things. There are albums like this one, Living in Darkness by Agent Orange, Rites of Spring, but where it was kind of like, okay, you can be into hardcore and kind of meld it with these other things and kind of broaden it, and add some nuance to it. This album was huge for that for me. I would say if you are interested in like the history of post-hardcore or emo, this is a pretty important album. It's actually not the first album historically that most people recommend. That's kind of why I thought it'd be fun to put in for this series, because it is an important stepping stone in the development of post-hardcore, but it's also kind of an overlooked one in a lot of ways. If you're a hardcore fan, you really got to listen to 7 Seconds. Maybe don't even start with this album. Maybe start with like The Crew or Walk Together, Rock Together. But really, they are like up there with Poison Idea in terms of like their influence on the genre. And again, I guess if you like what you'd call college rock, you like some 90s alternative rock, you like stuff like the Lemonheads or the Replacements, you like Kuskadoo, you'll love this album. This is right in line with all of that stuff.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I loved this album. I thought it was great. Both of my listens, because I only listened to this album twice as I typically do for the show, but both of them breezed by faster than I would say almost any album we've ever reviewed outside of maybe Document 8, but that album was also fucking 20 minutes long. So yeah, this to me I think is 100% recommended. If you really like, once again, 80s sort of post-punk, if you like The Cure to a certain extent, obviously, there's a lot of similarities here. If you want to see, once again, the development of hardcore and emo and even a little bit of some other genres in the 90s and 2000s, is a really good progenitor album to look at. And if you're also into punk and hardcore and post-punk albums with great lyrics, this is another album to look at. So yeah, I'm actually interested in actually listening to other albums by this band. Is there another one that you would also recommend, Brian?
I would say, so for me personally, the 7 Seconds have several pretty good albums after this, but after this, I mean, their peak is like from Walk Together, Rock Together to this album for me. I would go backwards and I would listen to Walk Together, Rock Together and The Crew. That is more hardcore. So you're going to hear it's heavier, it's more aggressive than this album. It's still more melodic than most hardcore, and it still has way better lyrics than most hardcore. And of course, it has Kevin's like surprisingly melodic vocals. But that's what I would say is go backwards and listen to their earlier albums from here.
Hell yeah, good to know on that. All right, so yes, without further ado, let us get into our pluggables here. So, as always, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please follow and subscribe to us on both our YouTube and our Spotify, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well, of course, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good friends Scott, Sean, and Robert are creating new episodes of their series, Lucifer and the Father. They need more moral and financial support to continue that series on, but I believe they're working on at least the next episode, right? Are they in production or still pre-production, Brian? Do you know?
They're still in pre-production, last I heard, but it is like happening. I'll hit Scott up and just see, if he wants to tell me anything about it. I think they're still in pre-production, but they're working fast, is my understanding.
All right. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, Brian, definitely get back to us because we need to know more. And then, of course, our promise to you is always that if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, and we will, within reason, match those donations about $20-25. Because, even though they are still currently in the process of creating new content for the series, we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to become a reality and make this show a reality. And, of course, we've been plugging this one as well. And I believe now it's going to be almost $1 million and maybe even close to $1 million by the time that this episode airs. But Luigi Mangione, his court case is proceeding. The last update I saw is that he pleaded not guilty to all of his charges, which makes sense because if he pleaded guilty, they would give him the death penalty. So there's no reason to plead guilty. There's nothing that there's no
they don't have anything. Why would he plead guilty?
It makes no sense. Yeah, it's not like pleading to, a pissing in public ticket or something like that. There's no reason to plead guilty in this situation.
But I mean, what evidence do they have?
Exactly. They have no evidence.
What leverage do they have where he can't say that he's not guilty? Of course he's not guilty.
No, exactly. And we believe in Luigi. You know, of course, both Brian and I have donated to the now official Luigi Mangione Defense Fund. So please donate to the campaign. And once again, with Lucifer and the Father, if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, and we will, of course, donate within reason and match those donations. So please do that. And of course, talk about funding things you believe in. Of course, we now have a Patreon page as well. You know, we have some great tiers on there. So please donate. We won't lock away any content. We never will, at least at this very moment. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think we ever will. But well, either way, you can get some content early from us because, you know, as I've said on the last episode, the first 48 hours are the most important. So if you do the $5 tier, you get to hear each episode 2 days early. And who doesn't want to hear our discussions 2 days early before everybody else hears it, right, Brian?
Well, yeah, you'll get to hear our opinions 2 days early, and then you can repeat them at the water cooler, and you can be ahead of the zeitgeist.
Exactly, 100%. So those are all my pluggables, Brian. Do you have any pluggables as well?
Yeah, as always, follow us at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. Best place to reach me if you want to criticize the show, if you want to ask us questions, if you want to send us cringe content to look at, if you hate me, if you want to kill me, if you want to send me pictures of you holding a blowtorch to a picture of me, that is the best and most efficient place to do it. There is also the Facebook page, Millennials Are Old, which mostly I use, again, to keep tabs on boomer Facebook nostalgia groups. They're actually pretty inactive. They're not talking as much. When they do talk, they seem really upset about something.
In this political climate, Brian, it could be anything.
Yeah, it seems like they're really mad at each other all the time. Like, I don't know, they're like arguing about something. I haven't had a phone in 4 days, so I don't know what's going on.
All right, so yes, with all of our pluggables out of the way, Brian, you know, Brian, it's late. And I think 7 seconds after we end this recording, I'm going to fall asleep. And, you know, just one day, Brian, I want to be able to sleep well. But you know what? Until then, Brian, I will sign off. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling like if we can talk together, then we can rockabye asleep separately.
You know what? I still believe in us, Brian.
Thank you for saving me from that. I tried something there, it didn't quite work out.
All right, so have a good night, everybody, and we're going to have a great episode for you next time, as always.